Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa, and I'm Selwyn Manning, and welcome to a new series of A View from Afar. And today we are going to cross to Paul Buchanan, my old friend and political scientist and also former Pentagon analyst. And we're going to approach this, the sixth series of A View from Afar, from a really a deep dive kind of prospect, just like Paul and I have done in previous series. But of course, with today, there are many, many, many changes, particularly when we deep dive into these geopolitical issues and trends. We will be unpicking relevancy at this time in this series from a world that is experiencing, obviously, rapid change and significance within that change. And today, in this topic, on this episode, we will be discussing, for example, how to define a way forward when the world is in chaos. Now, that's our topic, if you like. So what we're going to be doing in specific terms is look at, for example, I should say that since the re-election of the United States President Donald Trump, it's clear that Paul has been doing a lot of work, a lot of reading, and a huge amount of thinking. So he is with us today, and we're going to hear from Paul about all of that. But more importantly, Paul will look at the United States Trump administration's authoritarianism at home, imperialism abroad. It's a kind of a political currency, if you like. That's my word there. Paul and I will also look at how to deconstruct this entire spheres of influence nonsense, as Paul puts it. And about the United States' fears on the rise of the global south in a polycentric world. We'll be looking at that too. And Paul and I will lean forward into the near future, the medium term and the long term, and consider what to expect in that context. But as always, if you're listening to this, the first episode of Series 6 live, remember, you can join us in this live conversation by interaction. And if you're listening to us on the social media platforms, YouTube is the place to go for that interaction. It is certainly the best of them all for us to be able to see what you're saying and for us to respond and for you to interact. So with all that said, let's cross to Paul, who is waiting to discuss these issues with us. We're looking forward to this. Paul, here's Series 6. 6 years we've been doing this. We had a bit of a break last year. This is the first episode in it, and hopefully my introductions map out the course exactly and knit together with what your expectations in this are too. Welcome, Paul. Good to see you.
Yeah. Kia ora, Selwyn, and to anyone who's out there listening or watching. Yeah, it's been a long time in between drinks, as it were. And the irony is that some people who are closer to, close to me and you, of course, know that I was a bit burnt out and bummed out when Trump got reelected. And I felt I really needed a break because it was nothing but never-ending bad news as far as I was concerned. But I've come back and it's even worse. It's like...
maybe the key to it is you've started to have some insight into making sense of the chaos and being able to define some things like, people who followed A View from Afar in the past, Series 5 in particular, we started to really define where those precursors were landing with respect to change. And while Trump was only on the horizon as a possibility, hadn't at that stage firmed up as a probability to win the United States presidential elections, we were mapping out exactly what these, like the multipolar world, the constellation type arguments, all of these frames of which can make sense, particularly in a world that was reshaping. And so just picking up from that, it's quite exciting in a sense, really, in some ways, if you strip out all the awfulness, to be able to come back, that you've come back after a year and you're saying, this is what I've found and this is what I think.
Yeah, you put your finger right on it. I did have a lot of time to read and write. I continued doing the Kiwi Politico thing and developed some themes over the year. And you and I have talked. I mean, it isn't as if we didn't talk at all during the year hiatus. And yeah, a lot of what, we had pointed out is coming to fruition, but in ways different. We're not crystal ball, soothsayers. And so we were on track, but there's some, wrinkles that I think have developed that we can talk about, which actually make the conversation more interesting. But let me start with this, with a parallel. This show basically is about the death knell of the liberal internationalist order. Okay, it's over. But I'll start with a parallel that some may think is a little weird given the subject, but I actually see value in it. And the parallel is the Jeffrey Epstein case. Now you may go, whoa, demise of the liberal international order, Jeffrey Epstein, weirdness. I'm not interested in talking about the weirdness. I'll leave that for others.
Yep.
The fact is this: everybody mixed up in the Epstein business is a leader, a scion of the liberal internationalist order.
Yeah.
Bankers, presidents, politicians of all stripes, academics, they were the liberal international order epitomized. And look how decadent, look how, just nasty.
Yeah, so that hypocrisy that has come up to the top. You said to me last week, it's like a mask has been pulled off in a way and exposes the frailties of argument within what was the liberal international order. And that hypocrisy perhaps helps us to understand those that may be on the other side of this line. The rise of the global south countries, for example, states and powers, which are not geographical global south, of course, it's an intellectual construct, isn't it? But that hypocrisy perhaps explains the angst, the response, albeit within authoritarian states in many cases, to this conflict or, tension between those nations and what has been the Western-led, United States-led international order. So that's how I kind of pitch it too, in that sense.
Yeah, no, you're on track there. My reason for using the metaphor analogy is that these people did themselves in through their own excesses. No one shoved them from the outside.
No.
But they just, they overreached. And, we know where they overreached, but they got away with a lot. So until that moment, when then, they clearly lost the plot because they thought they had utter impunity. This was all a culture of impunity where these very powerful and wealthy people were protected time and time again. Well, the liberal international order, as you and I have talked about, the order that created the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and, an alphabet soup in between of international organizations, laws, norms, and rules. It was all built, as you said, under a veil of hypocrisy. In their own homes and whatnot, these people misbehaved. The liberal international order was built for and by white men, post-colonial, because it really kicked off after World War II. And then the entrance, the years of post-colonial independence. But it was made for them. The rules were made for the colonial powers. So the deck was stacked against the global south. And you're right, the global south is an ideological construct. India is in it, China's in it. But it basically means the post-colonial world. People were subjected to colonialism or neo-colonialism in the case of the Philippines, let's say. And so anyway, I could see that parallel there. But there's one twist to this that I could not see coming. I don't think anyone really did, but it's the following. Donald Trump. Now,
we've said it wrecking before. Ball.
Exactly. Look, we've said it before. For better or for worse, Donald Trump will be the seminal figure of the 21st century. I happen to think it'll be for the worst. But some good might come out of this, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the show. The deal is this. Donald Trump, in his second presidency, is he's basically like a black hole vortex in which he is pulling down the liberal international order with his behavior. Any pretense, that hypocrisy, that's one of the good things, is he has lifted that veil. And he shows
us that he's authentic in some ways, that he is basically pulling no punches, that that we're in a post-truth world now. Paul, you gave me an example about the ripple illustration on this. Can you put that into the context with this black hole type of thing? Because I think you explained that there to me in a way that for the visually minded, it's black and white and clear.
Yeah, when we had that conversation, I was telling you that, envision a rock being thrown into a pond. The ripple effects wash up on all shores of that pond, but in different ways, depending on whether it's a sandy surface or a rocky surface or whatnot. But Trump is the rock that's been thrown into the pond seen as the international order, or vice versa. And it's got two sides to it, as you mentioned. Domestic, and then in terms of international relations. But the key here is no one would have foreseen that it would be the United States that tears down the international order, because the United States was the primary beneficiary of it. Yeah. I mean, that's what makes this so absurd. It is like a theater of the absurd, because the MAGA administration, for whatever reason, clearly doesn't understand that however flawed the international order was, it served them better than anyone else.
From the currency being a centralized global currency, from the geopolitical positions, from the security intelligence networks, like it or lump it, the United States has been the epicenter of all of that, hasn't it?
Exactly. So, I've heard from friends in Latin America, and, a lot of us who live outside of the States, we're like, well, it's good that veil of hypocrisy has been lifted. Because if you don't live in the States, you see it. You see it. Everyone knows that the Yanks talk a good game about democracy and human rights and fair trade and whatnot, anti-corruption, and they're not so clean themselves. Okay, we've backed dictators. People know the story. Yeah. I mean, it's just
pulling out of the International Criminal Court, for example. Back when immediately prior to the invasion of Iraq, and then moves with exclusion certificates relating to alleged war crimes that may or may not occur in the course of that conflict. And those exclusion certificates, basically countries that were signatories to the ICC, giving exclusion to United States citizens who may find themselves on the wrong side of international law. All of those types of things, we wrote about way back in the 2003 period. Those are the issues of hypocrisy that we're talking about, aren't we?
Yeah, but let's think of it this way. Diplomacy often is hypocrisy cloaked as righteousness, right? So, it's the diplomatic thing. But the U.S. has abandoned any pretense of being a bastion of good. They're like, no, we're going to take Greenland. It's now out in the open. And that, believe it or not, is a good thing. Because now countries will look to themselves and each other a lot more than looking at the United States for guidance when it comes to issues of sovereignty, self-determination, those sort of things. But let me frame how this rock, when it's sunk, how it's created the ripples, because the ripples start at home. And I should preface that by saying there's one trouble with a descending great power. We've talked about it in the past, but it's worth a reminder. In times of transition, such as what we're living now in spades, on the international arena, the conflict is usually started by declining or descending great powers who are trying to cling to their position in the old status quo. And so they tend to start wars, minor conflicts, trade disputes, scapegoat, anything to be able to keep their position. But they're doomed. You know, the correlation of forces, to use an old Marxist term, is turned against them, and it's the ascendant powers that are eventually going to bump them off. And the United States was exactly such an ascendant power in the 1800s. They bumped off Spain, took its possessions, again, the Philippines I mentioned earlier, but Cuba, Puerto Rico. I mean, you know, the U.S. was at one point an ascending power. It became a superpower, and now it's in its decline. And I should preface that it's dangerous because declining powers start conflicts. And lo and behold, look at what the Yanks are doing. They're using force for, you know, weak reasons, you know, kidnapping the, yes, authoritarian leader of another country on trumped up charges. Venezuela. But they leave even worse dictators who are friendly to them or suck up to them. Now, I think the key here, though, is that I think it's fairly clear to the interested observer that you know, the U.S. is sinking this international liberal order. But I think what many, particularly people in the States, don't realize is that the U.S. is declining of its own accord. No one has pushed the U.S. under the waves. What has happened is, in order to project great power, you have to have high social cohesion. You have to have a uniform national project. You know, there can be disagreements around the margins, but you've got to have this cohesive ideology about who you are and where you want to go as a nation. Does the United States have that now? No. It's a deeply divided country, fighting over, quite frankly, incidentals, you know, these culture wars and wokeness and whatnot. And into that partisan fray have come extremist voices like Christian fascists. They don't call themselves fascists openly, but what they're calling for, you know, a retreat from women's rights, a retreat from gay rights, a retreat from civil rights, quite frankly, you know, that's all neo-fascist in nature.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the main problem, and again, it's like the Epstein crowd. The U.S. has done this to itself. You know, the U.S. is managing its own decline, even though those who are the main accelerants of the decline say they're doing everything to make America great again, because the architects are the MAGA administration. Now, whether or not the Russians have their fingers into the MAGA administration, you know, I don't know. I have my suspicions that some of this has been orchestrated from abroad, but I'm not going to pin the blame on the Russians or anyone else for the U.S. decline. They are clearly doing it to themselves. And a lot of us outside, we see it. You know, we see it in the way the U.S. behaves, the bullying behavior.
We also feel it too in a context too, don't we? You know, like over the later part of the 20th century in particular, we saw that the United States is a very persuasive and powerful exporter of culture. And a lot of it's good. Look at Elvis. Look at, you know, all of these things, the movie phenomenon and things like this that have come through. But it's a successful exporter of culture. It's also a successful exporter of culture in a negative sense, like in the current situation we find ourselves, which comes back to that illustration of the pond and the ripples going out across the globe. So with all of that, and if we kind of start to look at, for example, what you would refer to as the spheres of influence nonsense, where does that connect with all of this? Is this a part of the liberal international order that is frayed and fragmented and basically destroyed in the transition of being replaced with something? Spheres of influence, people hear a lot about that. Paul, what's your take on that?
Yeah, before I get into that, let me just say that and you mentioned culture, and I'm thinking, oh, you just captured something really good. When I think of Native American culture, right? I think of Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane, but now we got Kid Rock. All right. If you want to talk about decline, you got it right there. Let me say before I get into spheres of influence, because it's part of why the spheres of influence notion is rubbish. In order for the MAGA project to succeed, see, they may honestly believe that they are going to make the United States the preeminent country in the world again, when in fact they're accelerating its decline. They just don't see what they're doing to themselves. The project, which has its origins in Project 2025, in fact, I was just reading an article about John Vaught, the president of the Heritage Foundation that created Project 2025. He's like one of the puppet masters hiding behind the scenes, whispering into Trump's ear. The project goes like this. It's a two-sided coin. On the domestic front, increased authoritarianism. They've realized they have poured through every legal loophole. And not only are they committing atrocities like, what ICE is doing in Minneapolis, that is violating the basic civil rights of U.S. citizens as well as undocumented people there, to the point of killing people. But they're ignoring court orders. Trump just did this, in the past 2 days. The Supreme Court knocked him back on his tariffs. He's saying he's going to ignore the Supreme Court. And remember, we talked about this last year. The executive branch is the enforcement arm of the U.S. federal government. They are the repressive apparatus. Congress doesn't have its own police force. The Supreme Court surely doesn't. And so he's like, it was an old Brazilian dictator who said, well, at the end of the day, we got the guns, right? So, what we say rules. Trump is a variation of that. And so he's diminishing, to use an understatement, the rule of law. But it's all in pursuit of an authoritarian project that in turn has its roots in a lack of appreciation, or in fact, a contempt for liberal democracy. That is, to Trump and his backers, democracy has given too many people too many rights. There's too much arguing in the room. And so now they're going to reimpose what to me looks like a patriarchal, heterosexist, capitalist Christian vision of the preferred American society. But that's going to be difficult to achieve because the United States, among many other things, is going to be majority brown by 2050. The demographics are.
So if this has legs and continues on, you can expect oppression, considering the ethnicity changes, the demographic changes that are coming to the United States. The other thing is the United States has long been believed from outside, and certainly within, that there were structural constitutional guardrails. Now, what you're illustrating here is because the might sits within the prerogative of the administration, the executive branch of government, that those guardrails are no longer effective. That's part of the answer, isn't it, in a sense?
Yeah. In fact, long, long ago, we talked about how the presidency was like being placed into a straitjacket. And I believed that for a long time. Now I realize I was wrong. What it is it's a self-binding strategy. That is, executives obeyed the rule of law. Okay, they would never think to challenge the Supreme Court once the final decision was made. But thanks to the Heritage Foundation and this guy, John Boyd, they said, hey, look it, they're going to make a ruling, but they don't have enforcement power. You do. And if you don't like the ruling, you tell them to bugger off. What are they going to do? What? Sue you again. And in fact, Trump's alluded to this.
He has. I guess those that looked at the Minnesota killings at the hands of ICE, irrespective of the evidence which was clear for those watching those videos of what happened leading up to and during the murder of those two individuals, the administration responded with dictating what the situation was all about. And that was prior to and relegating as ineffective the collection of evidence that may have been once in a past time tested in court for its validity and a judgment applied to that, and then consequential sentencing, etc., or consequences to that. The administration has basically maneuvered into the front end of that. And I kind of have deep concerns about that because it describes and displays perhaps an absolute assurance on their part that they not only believe but are in fact in a situation where they can control what is a supposed truth. And that's why I mentioned earlier on in the episode, the post-truth period is what it put there. And also concerns that perhaps it's an illustration too that they are confident that they have corrupted the judicial process and the independence of that wing of democratic governments to the point where they're no longer irrelevant. So what you're talking with the Supreme Court here with respect to the economics and tariffs is perhaps, in my mind, another expression of that same pattern coming to the fore.
Yeah, no, I mean, look at all of this is done by design. I mean, the gaslighting over the murders was a bit excessive even for them, given all the video evidence and what have you. But the larger point is that because of how Trump thinks, and remember, he's a hollow shell. It's the people around him. Steve Bannon from the outside, Peter Navarro on tariffs, also from the outside. But then on the inside, guys like Vaught, because he's apparently working in a supposedly minor position in the Office of Management and Budget, but Steve Miller. I mean, you look at ICE and all that, and you see Steve Miller's thumbprint all over that. But because of Trump's mindset, the idea, I believe, is that he wants to confront the external world. So engage the world community from what he perceives to be a position of strength at home. And for him, that means authoritarian imposition. He admires dictators. He admires President Xi in China because the guy's a strongman. He likes Viktor Orban, who has basically destroyed democracy in Hungary. I don't know what he thinks about Putin, but I bet you he's jealous, that Putin can do what he does.
Well, there's parallels that you can see in what Trump is ratcheting out and racing ahead with real momentum. Some of the structures of what they're doing in the United States is very, very close to where Putin was, but at a slower pace within the Russian Federation, particularly from 2014 onwards. So, there are parallels. Perhaps his people have said, this is how you do it. We've got a template here. It could well be. But the overall idea, I think, is that he consolidates his authoritarian control at home. And we'll really get a good test of that if he decides to cancel the midterm elections. You see, if unrest continues in blue states against the ICE raids and that sort of thing, there is now, people are reporting that he's thinking
about declaring a state of national emergency, declaring martial law and sending troops into places like Chicago, New York, blue places, not red places, and then citing the unrest and whatnot, canceling the elections, at least in those states.
Yeah, hybrid type of approach.
Yeah. Now and what happens is, if that occurs, if the elections are wholly in part canceled, then Congress is frozen at its representation levels the day before Election Day, which is Republican dominated. All right?
And that's interesting because I understand that in the Congress, the members, the elected members, there are more intending on vacating their office and not putting their name forward for re-election from the GOP side than since 2013, if I've got my figures right here. So that's a factor too, isn't it? In the sense that some of them in the Republican Party are thinking, we don't want to be around when what's coming is going to come.
Yeah. It's just, it's a sordid play. But, if you had asked me a year ago if this was possible, I would have said, what are you smoking? Now, it's in the realm of the possible. There'll be legal challenges and whatnot. But returning to our interest today, he wants to consolidate, because he admires these other dictators. And then, having shown that he can literally kill his own people, repress at home, and enforce his will upon his own, he then turns to the outside world and he looks at people like sheep. He looks at Putin. Well, Putin maybe not so much, but he looks at the landscape of wannabe authoritarians and decadent democracies, and he says, you see what I just did at home? And we're like, supposedly the best democracy on earth, blah, blah, blah. I just did that at home. Imagine what I can do to you guys. And oh, by the way, I'll give you a few examples. I'll snatch this authoritarian and take his oil. I'm going to blockade Cuba because I just feel like it. It's no harm to us to have the Cubans, thumbing their noses at us. But
it's a bit of a wake-up call for those inside the United States too, and United States citizens, I think. And I'll just very quickly give an illustration of what I mean here. Going way back to the beginnings of the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, in Kabul, it was well publicized, this massive bomb went off. Terrible thing. There are bodies everywhere. And amongst the carnage, there's Afghani, obviously, but NATO troops, NATO support people, logistics, and United States soldiers and citizens who were in the mayhem and killed from this bomb. And out of the rubble comes this American officer in some form, probably special forces, but I'm guessing on that. Anyway, the point is, and he says, turn the cameras off, we have dead Americans here, in amongst the carnage of humanity that has been blown to bits. What I'm getting at here is that sense for the American citizen that there was some sort of privileged position relating to citizenship. And the United States citizen could expect to be looked after back home with special privileges compared to perhaps immigrants back in the United States. And certainly overseas, there were certain privileges relating to law that we identified earlier on in this podcast. The killings in Minnesota, where the administration then justified, in part, those murders on the basis of their identity or their political persuasion, or applying labels to them that would somehow make it justifiable, particularly with those that may live and subscribe to Trumpism in various Republican states. That to me was an undermining of not just the citizenship, but also the expectation that as a United States citizen who is white, you could go out there and if you felt compelled, you could record the injustices that were happening to immigrants and coloured people and actually stand there and say, I am a US citizen, but within minutes you're actually murdered in your car as you try to actually drive away. Paul, I think that domestically, that illustrates so many different things in a matrix of problematic or problems that can be once again exported around the world. So the domestic situation, that's what we're seeing. Where are we going internationally? You've just started to talk about that. And also this other point that we have raised in preparing for this podcast about the United States' fears of the rise of a response to all of this with the global south in what you have talked about with me prior to, a polycentric world. Shall we move on to that?
Yeah, no, we are. We're slowly making our way there. I'll simply say this on the domestic front. The increased resort to repression to impose his authoritarian will is a sign of weakness, not strength. You know, I coined the phrase a long time ago when I was writing about state terror in Argentina that repression obeys a form of Newtonian law. It wanes over time when it's used as the basis for rule. You cannot repress the same amount of people in the same measure forever. Something's going to break. Either your will, because after all, the repressors are police people and border patrol. You know, they have families, they have hearts, believe it or not. So maybe the will of the repressive apparatus will give, or people will realize they have nothing to lose by resisting. And that actually is starting to happen. So it's another measure of U.S. decline. But that's not how Trump and his minions see it. They see it as strength. You know, it's like, you know, steroid strength. You know, it's not the real basis for power. Now, maybe that is a mindset that's shared by the likes of Viktor Orban and Erdogan in Turkey, Bukele in El Salvador, even the crazy man Milei in Argentina. Maybe, but ultimately, it's going to lead to the demise of the United States as a world leader. And it's already, I mean, again, people in the States may not see it as starkly as we do. And that brings up the issue of it. So, what is their vision of the post-liberal future? Because, you know, that's happening.
In a geopolitical sense.
Yeah. And for some reason, they have decided to go back to the McKinley era, the so-called Gilded Age. So 1880s, 1890s, the height of U.S. imperialism, quite frankly, and engage in a neo-imperialist project that starts out with the silly renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. I mean, this is like gold leafing stuff, you know? It's like, what? You know? But then getting more serious, making true, you know, serious claims on Canada, threatening Mexico, I mean, to, you know, enlarge them. They have taken control of Venezuela's oil. They are serious about Greenland because with global warming, which they don't admit, you're opening up the Northern Passage. So that becomes a major waterway in a way it has never been. And so there is a scramble because there are resources on the seabed. You know, there's a lot of reasons. But the U.S. already has exclusive military rights in Greenland dating back to 1949. So all this saber rattling and stuff is...
And it had some deal during World War II for a while there too with Greenland, the Danish.
And that's...
I'm a little bit vague on it, to be honest, but there was something there, wasn't
it? That became the basing agreement of 1949, right, which gives the U.S. exclusive rights. At one point, it had like 30 military bases in Greenland right after World War II. Now it's down to one, which is basically a satellite tracking station. They can put more at any point. The Danes and the Greenlanders have never said no. So all of this...
Yeah, you don't need to buy it, purchase it. When this came up on the radar first, we all kind of laughed and thought, it's ridiculous, he's certainly not serious. But then you start to realise very quickly earlier in 2026 that actually this has got, late 2025, this has got legs. This is serious, it's a problem, destabilising. Another NATO country that has territorial interests in the country. And an indigenous population that's resistant to even accepting quite large sums comparatively for their authorization of the handover, the purchase of the country.
Yeah, well, as someone said about the Greenlanders, they're very much, let's say, like the Cook Islands are to New Zealand. They're an autonomous territorial entity of Denmark. But as someone pointed out, said, so let's get it straight. The United States think the Greenlanders are going to give up universal free medical care, universal free education, all these Danish benefits to join a U.S. style healthcare system, a U.S. style education. Seriously? But the thing is this. Now, I happen to believe that Trump is seriously mentally deficient. Take Biden, times it by 10. He just manifests it in a different way. And he's not quite as physically frail, although that's starting to show. I think you can whisper things into his ears, like we can take Greenland. And because he is so ignorant of historical reality, I'd be willing to bet that when he heard about Greenland, he didn't realize that it was a dependency of Denmark, a NATO ally. Because now you're threatening NATO.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that there are some issues with Trump, obviously, as you've laid out. I'd add to that personality disorder, which is far better defined by people that are specialists in that field. But I'll also say that he's got rat cunning, and we saw that very acutely, I think, in the presidential debates when Biden showed up. And Trump knew just how far to push that without people actually thinking this is seriously uncool. I think that moment when Trump turns and he says, well, I don't know what he is saying, but he didn't know what he was saying either. I'm paraphrasing here, but that type of thing. He put the spotlight on Biden without making the guy the focus of his ridicule beyond a tolerable level. Some would say it was intolerable anyway, but so the rat cunning is what I don't know if that's a saying that is in the United States, but in New Zealand and these parts of the South Pacific, that's one of the phrases that we would say, that when it comes to issues of campaigning, where it comes to issues of timing, like that there's a certain degree of rat cunning in play, like his posturing when the assassination attempt was made on his life. The flag is behind him, but he turns and up goes the hand. His sense of moment is very, very acute. So I think there's a lot of merit in being able to dig in and approach this Trump administration, approach Trump and Trumpism and his peoples that make all of this possible from the point of view of political science, certainly sociological, psychological elements, and certainly from the point of view of anthropology to answer all of these things with respect to Trump. But we get back to a person that perhaps from a lay person's point of view projects narcissism and the various degrees of that onto the world stage. And the concerns would be that what happens when there is pushback, when we have a Trump-led administration on what is very significantly a global power as a consequence of this kind of behaviours that we're seeing back home, but if it is actually propelled even more in the international arena.
Yeah, I mean, let's give credit where credit's due. Because of Trump's withdrawal from the world stage as, the main defender, we've talked about the hypocrisy, but as ostensibly the defender of global values and, democracy and all that, he's retreated. I'll give him credit because he's now forced, not just the Europeans, but mainly the Europeans in the current moment, to start looking to themselves, let's say for defense against Russia, but also for trade. For a century, maybe century and a half, the world has looked to the United States as the epicenter. Now they no longer will. And that's why I say it's over. The world will never look at the United States the same as a result of the MAGA experience. The MAGA experience is a stain that will not wash out once he's off the scene, because there are other people who have benefited. You know, I think J.D. Vance is sitting there, you know, waiting his moment. But the world is starting to see that it's time for a different order. And I'm about to get to the global south on this and the role of middle powers. But let me first say the notion of sphere of influences was brought up in sort of post Bismarck, mid 1800s. So, you know, latter half of the 19th century, when there was a transitional moment to emerging great powers that included Russia, Tsarist Russia, the United States now, you know, after the Civil War, really starting to emerge as an industrial and agricultural power, separated by oceans from enemies. You know, a number of power, Germany at that point was ascendant. And so the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, you know, James Monroe made the proclamation. It's not a treaty, it's not a law, it's just a declaration by one U.S. president.
Of intent.
And it basically, so it just said that the U.S. would not allow any extra hemispheric powers to come into Latin America militarily and try to take territory and whatnot. They had defeated the Spanish. They were warding off the French. So, you know, there was some great power jostling. And that was 1823. Then in 1898, I think it was, Teddy Roosevelt expanded that with the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically said the U.S. would be the debt collector for any European countries that were owed money by Latin Americans. Because the Europeans were demanding that, you know, loans and whatnot that have been paid to very weak governments in Latin America, you know, would be covered by force if they weren't paid back. And you have to remember that at that time, with few exceptions, Latin America was very divided. The countries that exist now were still splintered. There was, you know, chieftains and, you know, large landlords basically ruling as, you know, kings. It wasn't settled yet in the sense of, okay, established borders, the rule of law, all that. So the Europeans wanted their money back. Roosevelt said, well, you can't come in and we won't allow you, but we'll recover the debts for you. You know, we'll go down, we'll send down a Navy ship, bomb Veracruz or bomb Caracas, and we'll get your money, which they did. So now we've got the, it's the Don Rowe Doctrine, which basically is unenforceable because the world has changed. The Don Rowe Doctrine, right, a play on Monroe Doctrine, it says that the U.S. will not allow any foreign power to establish a significant presence in the region. And again, what is he smoking? The Chinese are there. The Chinese are the biggest trading partner of all of South America. It's happened under their eyes.
And have been investing in the country's infrastructures for some years now.
Yeah, because the Chinese know all about soft power. So they're in there. You know, the biggest port in Latin America opened up last year in Peru. It's entirely Chinese, entirely. They have, they're in the lithium mines, you know, the critical minerals. Well, that's all Chinese companies because the Americans couldn't be bothered investing there, at least on terms that seemed reasonable to Latin Americans. So he may proclaim this Don Rowe Doctrine, but he can't enforce it. And see, that's just it. The emperor has no clothes. Countries are realizing, yeah, he can take Venezuela or take the leadership of Venezuela because they were particularly venal and corrupt and vulnerable. So you could do a limited military raid. Are you going to try that with Colombia? You know, are you going to try that with Brazil? No. You know, I don't think that's going to happen. First of all, because the Colombians are the most blooded military in Latin America. They've been fighting the drug wars. They were fighting the FARC guerrillas forever. They're not going to roll over. Plus, they're very nationalistic. So he's just blowing smoke, and countries have seen that. So the sphere of influence concept, and the way the MAGA administration is phrasing it is: we get the Western Hemisphere, including Greenland. Russia can have Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Good luck with that. China can have East Asia. And again, I always go back. Are you high? Do you think for a second that the Eastern European countries are going to allow themselves to be reabsorbed into a Warsaw Pact sort of orbit after years of exposure to Western Europe? I don't think so. The Central Asian republics, they're very wealthy. They're authoritarian, to be sure, but they're not going to just subsume. They're still related to Russia because of the Soviet experience, but they've had now 25, 30 years of independence. And don't get me started on East Asia. Did he ever talk to the Japanese and the Koreans about that? Yeah. And so it's a pipe dream. And what's interesting, and here's where conflict becomes, again, another issue. When you create spheres of influence in traditional geopolitical theory, you have your spheres, but in between them are what are known as, generically, they're known as zones of contestation. Specifically, they're known as peripheral and shatter zones. Peripheral zones are places no one cares about. So you can trial your weapons there by funding a local insurgency against the other guy's regime. You can play around. Shatter zones are where great powers meet in offshore. Not directly face-to-face in the motherlands, but someplace else. Central Europe during the Cold War, that was the shatter zone.
Yep.
And there's this idea that you can do spheres of influence and not have core and peripheral areas and zones of contestation that include shatter zones is ludicrous.
I'd add, even from the point of view of trade, if you look at the BRICS and the expansion of BRICS, it's engagement with, obviously the B stands for Brazil, So I don't see an expansion of NAFTA in any form, latter or previous. Just don't see it. BRICS, on the other hand, is forward-leaning. There's a momentum, and I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying how it is. Forward-leaning, expanding, should I say, all of that is an illustration that is counter to the spheres of influence, I'd say, theory.
No, and you got it, because and you're absolutely right about trade. Okay, so the structure, let's say the global political economic architecture is not the late, it's not the late 18th century anymore. We're not in Kansas, Dorothy. The hard fact is we are interconnected, and places that used to be peripheral to great power competition, such as sub-Saharan Africa, such as Oceania, down here, have become zones of contestation. The big powers are, everything's at play. And so it's nuts, okay? It's absolute nuts. Now, this gets to the point you opened up with the rise of the global South, motivating the United States to make these land grabs and, make these proclamations. What the U.S. seems to have misread, we talked for the first 5 years of the show, we have talked about moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And we've talked at length about, the contours and the dynamics. And basically the only thing that needed to be resolved would be, what would the 5 great powers be in the new multipolar world? And we thought about the BRICS. We thought about, a resurgent Japan. Russia is not a great power. Russia has an economy the size of Texas or Italy. It's only a military power, and it's only its nukes that back everybody off, because otherwise, I think
Yeah,
NATO would have.
I'd add
NATO.
it's a cultural power in many of the classical senses, and also from the point of view of political export, it has a power in that under the current thing, and that's
Yeah, well,
another element of being disturbed. That's for sure. But there we have it.
I think what's happened is it's not multipolarity that we're moving towards, and this is a late correction for me after more than 10 years of writing about the transition to multipolarity. We're moving to a polycentric world.
Yeah, let's
So you're
describe
not.
that.
Yeah, and it's a polycentric world made up of technopoles. You see, the world is moving. The most advanced economies in the next 50 years will be what former Prime Minister Helen Clark here in New Zealand called the knowledge economies. Knowledge production, knowledge storage, knowledge commodification. That is the future. And visionaries such as Musk, if you think that way, are now their ambitions are great. You know, he's looking up at Mars and whatnot, but there are a number of good thinkers who realize that knowledge literally is power at this point. And so technopoles are developing in places like Qatar and the UAE in order to create these massive data centers because they become autonomous sources of power. In fact, I read recently Silicon Valley is drawing out plans to develop its own electric network exclusively to power data centers. So you and I, if we lived in Arizona, we wouldn't get to see it. But the big corporate providers of knowledge, they would get that power. You know, and it could be nuke, it could be any mixture. So I think where we're moving is to a polycentric world in the sense that it's not multipolar in the sense that a polycentric world are shifting alliances of states and non-states, all fused, if you will, around these emerging knowledge economies. And the knowledge economies will not just be data centers. You know, there'll be some countries will specialize in the production of specific types of knowledge. Let's say, I don't know, biomedicine or medical engineering. That's where the division of labor in the world seems to be going. If you look, I mean, and I'm sure Musk and Peter Thiel and some of these other, what are they called, tech bros, I think they see it. I don't think Trump and his minions see it. You know, I think they see the rise of the South. You know, they see countries that have been grossly underdeveloped in the past. You know, let's say Brazil in many respects, but the Arabs, the Arab oligarchies, it was all about oil and nothing else. They're changing. They're now becoming highly sophisticated economies. And it's a lot more than just oil. Because they're not stupid. They realize oil is a finite resource. And so they've got to move onto other ventures to keep their positions. Well, the Chinese, the Japanese, I mean, pretty much anyone who can look down the road 10 to 15 years will go, this is where we're headed. And we either get out in front and, retain our place or become one of these polycenters, or we get left behind. And what's left behind are countries, well, I hate to say it, like New Zealand, that are raw material producers, mainly of critical minerals, but there brings New Zealand again. This right-wing government here, and I'm only going to talk once about New Zealand, this right-wing government in New Zealand is cutting a deal with the Trump administration to mine critical minerals in our national parks. Okay, it's short-sighted beyond belief because again, Trump's not going to be around forever, and a lot of what he's done is going to be reversed. The gold leaf, for
And they
example.
could probably satisfy the man, I'm being probably facetious here, with offering him a free golf course. It would probably achieve
Well,
the same thing. And
yeah,
just for those that aren't aware, New Zealand's position with respect to being an attractive proposition for many in the global community is because of its national parks, its untouched natural virgin bush that have been well protected for many, many, many years. So that's where Paul's coming from. He's acutely aware of that and lives amongst the bush um, himself,
yeah,
and enjoys the benefits and otherwise with the pollens. But there we have it. But Paul, so this is you. You're starting to lean forward into this, and I know you like I like doing that too. That
yeah,
when we're doing an analysis, we've talked about this. I think that there is an energy that within a certain context that we can see on a timeline that these types of things are starting to show under certain conditions. Decision makers that are prominent at this time make these types of decisions, that the impact on the global community we can see is intensifying in these areas. And so therefore, without being soothsayers or crystal ball gazers, under certain conditions we can say in the medium term it is possible, and perhaps in some cases it's firming up to a probability that we are going to experience this in the medium term. So just with that kind of methodology sketched out in a rudimentary way, let's lean forward. Let's see what we can expect in any aspect of what we've discussed already in the medium term going forward.
yeah. So let's just think of a few hallmarks of this transitional moment moving forward. Um, we have the nexus of AI and robotics, nanotechnologies, these sort of things. What it's going to do, as many have written about this, it removes blue collar labor from the equation. Humans will not be doing those tasks as we see in automobile assembly lines. What used to take 1,000 workers working 10-hour days takes 50 machines with 2 operators to do, in an hour. And it's advancing exponentially because of the AI boom. Now that bubble will burst probably towards the end of this year. There's just too much money going into too many silly ventures.
Mm.
Smart money is already starting to pull out of AI, venture capital things. But my point is that visionary leaders, are starting to see the wave of the future. It may include the prevalence of cryptocurrencies. Right now, it still seems to be the province of scam artists and opportunists like Trump himself. But I think it's here to stay, and people realize that it may be a more reliable currency against the whims of politicians in places like the White House. Let's remember, Trump is messing with Treasury. He's trying to fire, the Federal Reserve chair. In fact, he's going to replace him in May. The political tinkering with things like, currency exchanges, interest rates, and the likes, that can eventually be resolved if administered correctly, and maybe AI will wind up being the administrator of things like cryptocurrency.
So what you're saying is what exists today is the cryptocurrency structures, and as an alternative and a response to centralization and tinkering, we have a decentralized system already that may take some, talking international transaction type of issues here. So that in many cases has been proven to be achievable, and it's been proven to be effective. So that would be an interesting kind of thing to see exactly how it responds outside of the value applied to, for example, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The ones with utility in this context. So if you look at the ability to use a decentralized system to deliver and transfer the cost of goods or the payment of goods, then it may be very much a strong response to what you're talking about defined here. I would just put that back to you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert by any means in crypto, but I think that those who are, they're looking down the road and they're seeing the manipulation of the U.S. dollar. I'm attuned to it because I have incomes derived from the United States. So I'm always watching the exchange board. I'm sort of like the way I used to be in Argentina, watching what the Argentines call the merry-go-round, where you watch your currency relative to the yen, the pound sterling, and you try to buy when your currency is strongest against one of the big currencies. Well, looks like a little bit of that is starting to happen in little old New Zealand. We have an optimal price of one New Zealand dollar 60 cents on the U.S. dollar, and that's for the exporters. So usually everybody's happy if the New Zealand dollar stays at 60 cents for the U.S. Last year, the last half of the year was down around 56. So I did well on the exchange, but now it's up right around 60, and they're trying to stabilize it. The New Zealand central bank is either dumping money or buying dollars in order to try to keep that level. Well, I think everybody's playing that game, but now with dollars. They realize the United States, this is something you said 2 years ago, 3 years ago. If you stand back, with distance comes perspective. You look at the United States and you realize it's an unstable polity and an unreliable partner.
Yeah.
And so you have to hedge. And so that's what's going on. People are hedging, but they're looking to the future. That's why there are people going,
Maybe we anchor on that as we lean forward, the hedging. So we see hedging from the point of view of security relationships. We see hedging from the point of view of offshoring different things, onshoring different things. We see hedging in this currency areas relating to the currencies, decentralized or centralized, hybrids of the two. That hedging, I think you've landed on something that defines exactly what is going on in the global, the geopolitical, geosecurity, the geoeconomics, the geofinance areas. So that's really, really important. It hits on one word and helps to define exactly this moment in time as we lean forward and perhaps what we can expect. Paul, we've got a question that's come in from Ken Collins, and thanks, Ken, for coming there. I'll just bring it up on screen if I may. Add to the broadcast. There we are. You should be able to see it. In this context, at this point in the discussion, because we've already mentioned Canada in the context of Trump's ambitions, but where do you see Canada in this global environment? Now, Ken, I interpret your question there as being in the context that we have seen an independence coming out of Canada, out of Ottawa, that is perhaps more independently aligned because of its degraded relationship with the Trump White House. And in that context, Paul, how do you see Canada, a significant player, not just a Commonwealth country closely aligned to the United Kingdom, but closely aligned, obviously, with the European partners, and has embarked on firming up through necessity, perhaps, trade relationships with China that are deeper than ever in a historical sense?
Well, I'd first say that Mark Carney is the leader that the United States should have. He's proven to be a remarkable political figure. And quite frankly, the U.S. actions and the threats against Canada have liberated Canada. Canada has been set free by the U.S. behavior, and it's going to become a global leader as a result of this and because of Carney. These new constellations of countries I would say all the most important ones will include Canada, because it's no longer seen, as Trump would say, as the 51st state. All of this is brought out in stark relief. The distinctive identity of the Canadians. And yeah, there's a lot of MAGA Canadians, and they're bitching and moaning. But the fact is, it's Canadians, they now see the difference between their liberal democracy and whatever is going on in the States these days. So I actually think, and this goes back to, where are we headed in this polycentric world? I think we're going to see these new, constellations of middle powers, maybe pooling resources around these emerging knowledge economies, putting things together in a different way. But I will say this, and it's not necessarily the dark side, but the downside. The era of democracy promotion, of humanitarian assistance, that's over. That's dying with liberal internationalism. We're going to go back to a international system in which your interest in other countries ends at their borders. So, rioting protesters in Iran don't care. As long as they provide stable relationships with the rest of the world and stop humbugging Israel, do your thing. Okay? You're not, we're culturally different. We don't like it, but, and I think that unfortunately is the downside of this, is we're going to see a regression. There'll still be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but no one's going to really adhere to it if they don't want to. I mean, some will. Canada will. But others, including the United States, may not. And as you just said a while ago, if you're not going to sign on to the International Criminal Court, then you've already played your hand. It's like, the rules don't apply to us. So I think that'll be a bit downside. And the way to repackage it would be respect for sovereignty will be one of the foremost international principles, right?
That's very reminiscent of New Zealand's trade-led identity, in the sense that New Zealand would trade with anyone. If it was going to buy its goods, it would trade. It may sit there in a meeting like we know, where one of our leaders may sit down with Xi Jinping. So you've got this minnow and you've got this giant of a country. And they may say, with absolute respect, New Zealand has a problem with respect to our values and how we apply them politically with what we are seeing with the Uyghur people. But let's not let that rock in the road be a hindrance to us navigating this way forward. And that, I guess, in some ways, what you're describing is that kind of self-pragmatism, self-interested pragmatism that develops out of that. What benefits, though, do you see coming out of this now that the hood of hypocrisy has been lifted off, that the response from the global south, what does that look like for perhaps those that still have an interest in an internationalist world? And I don't mean that from the old, binary kind of communist free world type of argument. I mean from the point of view of international engagement.
Yeah, it's and that's the upside, is that we do need international institutions. The global architecture needs a political edifice, and the thing is, it can no longer be an edifice constructed for and by white male Europeans. Okay, it can't.
Yeah.
And so the new edifice in the global architecture is going to be built by people from the global south, which means brown people. It's going to be fundamentally different in orientation because it's post-colonial. But institutions are about regulating conflict. Believe it or not, we put institutions together, including our political institutions, our economic institutions, are founded on the notion that they diminish conflict. Instead of pointing a gun and taking someone's money, You do a loan, you charge interest, whatever the case is. It civilizes everything. Whether you're from the North or the South, you need that because it offers security. It offers stability to international relationships. So, out of the ashes of the liberal internationalist order is going to come a South driven global order that will have political and economic and military manifestations, but it won't be dominated by the interests of the colonial powers of the 19th and 20th centuries. That's what will be gone. Now, it could be just resurrected. I would think, for example, the World Health Organization would reflect the concerns of the global South, and that would be seen in, for example, a much larger emphasis placed on not only infectious disease mitigation, but poverty alleviation, potable water. I mean, they do all those things, but those will become far more important if representatives of the global South come into it. Uh, a lot of the cutbacks that are now done bilaterally, let's say by the now defunct U.S. aid organization, with the demise of that agency, uh, other countries will step in, and I think they will reflect more of a Southern orientation. So, it's not as if the place is going to collapse and there'll be no international institutions. What's going to happen is those institutions will be resurrected with a South flavor. And what that is exactly, I'm not sure, but I think that it'll probably be more equitable than the current arrangements that we have, because our current arrangements, including things like the World Bank and the IMF, are still dominated by North Americans and Europeans. And that has to change. The interests of others has to be brought into the equation. So uh, that I think will take a decade or more to come into place. But the first thing that has to happen, all of this will start when Trump leaves the scene.
Yeah.
And so there might be some sequels, some bloodletting amongst the MAGA guys. We won't get into it here, but it's very clear MAGA has split into an American.
As you've raised there, I think just to hit on that and very concisely, what we're seeing perhaps arguably with the Trump political phenomenon in the United States is that there is very fast formed a personalized autocracy around this man, irrespective of whether or not he's the instrument of underlying powers. That the succession in such structures, when the emphasis and tolerance is solely on the current president of the United States, would suggest that succession is not an easy transformation once he has gone. And considering his point in age, considering his point of usefulness, perhaps, in what could be a long-term plan, one could expect change of some form to come quicker rather than later, and perhaps obviously in the 2-year period from here out. So with that, Paul, let's wrap it up. And I hand it back to you, and then we'll say au revoir for now.
Yeah, I think that this year is going to be pivotal in that the fractures that I just mentioned. Again, America First, which is the nationalistic wing of MAGA, and then the Make America Great crowd. That's the other faction. So America First versus MAGA. The MAGA crowd are more globalists. They include big business, the fossil fuel industry. They're not as nativist and nationalist as America First. And I happen to think that America First represents the dumber side of MAGA, and that they are living in the past. That I don't have much use for MAGA as a whole, but that the MAGA faction at least understands that the United States, in their vision, is the first amongst equals in the global arena. I disagree with that, but I can live with that. And I think all of this is going to come to a head this year, because those midterms will make or break them. And this administration, it's such a reflection of Trump's personality. It doubles down every time it makes a mistake and challenges. It
Mm.
doubles down.
Gets
He's
the
doing it with
spade out
terror.
and gets the spade out and digs deeper.
Yeah, and so the contradictions inherent in that movement are going to be laid bare and transparent as we move into election season. And primaries are already starting. Primaries are, picking up. There's a couple of special elections. And I think that's when things are going to hit the fan.
Mm.
Uh, Now, whether or not he declares martial law, I mean, as far fetched as all that is, we shall see. But certainly the seeds of the destruction of the MAGA movement are being sown today. And the fruit will come when Trump leaves, whether in a box or walking, and these guys dissemble, it becomes a knife fight. And at that point, the new order, since he's killed off, see, he's good at destruction, but he's not good at rebuilding, no matter what they say about him being a construction magnate back in the day. And then the international world, or international community, will have time to, having looked at each other more seriously, uh, say, you know what, we're going to modify the international system. We're going to give a voice to sub-Saharan Africa in a way they haven't before. Not just little regional organizations that do nothing. No, we're actually going to bring them to the big boys table. Because, there's 60% of the global's population. If you want to build technopoles, you don't necessarily need diamonds or whatnot, but you may need sun. There's, energy sources. And so I actually think that this will be the pivotal year. And if MAGA consolidates its hold in the midterms, then we've got a few more years of darkness until the 2028 presidential election. But all of that gives time to the rest of the world to really then deepen their hedging strategies, right? You talked about it earlier, and I'm with you on that one. The name of the game right now for the rest of us is hedging. Hedge against the normal uncertainties of the future, but hedge against the insanity that is the current, White House administration, and hope for the best. Now, here again, New Zealand either tries to kiss his rear or just get off the radar scope entirely. And I know a lot of small countries are just like, let's just get below the wall and wait until he's passed. But either way, uh, dramatic changes are afoot. They are going to deepen. And whether you like it or not, unfortunately or fortunately, it's all because of this person known as Donald Trump.
Amazing, isn't it? Okay, Paul, thank you for that. And to those that are got to this point in the podcast, thank you very much for the investment of your time. We really appreciate that, and we know it's valuable. It's a valuable thing. So we intend to be back with an episode of Deep Dive into such issues about once a month. And sometimes we might be a bit early, sometimes we might extend that out, but we'll be looking at trying to land on once a month. We think that's a good rhythm to be able to do to sustain this type of thing, and also to be able to take our ideas to other forums as well when we can. So thank you again, and we look forward to your company once again in the near future, in March sometime. Until then, ka kite anō. Thank you, Paul, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.